Iran right now, and I know you just came from a discussion on Iran. Here's a question I have, because I saw a quote that you had the other day in USA Today. Absent Iran's help, you said, I don't believe President Bashar al-Assad would have been in power the last 6 months. And I'd like you to explain how Iran is keeping Bashar al-Assad in power in Syria.
Well, I think, Wolf, you have to look at what happened in Syria and what developed there. Peaceful demonstrations, Assad's thugs start shooting on them. After Russia's regrettable veto in the United Nations, it's like Assad gets a second wind. But absent the Quds force, specifically a general named Soleimani, and his support, and the support, let me be very specific, weapons, ordnance, ammunition, leadership, fighters, money, absent that orchestrated support under a rather murderous brigadier named Hamadani, I think Assad would have found himself simply overrun by the gathering momentum against him. As it is, he has been able to recently turn around with some tactical successes in western Syria, thanks to the Iranian support and the Lebanese Hezbollah support. Lebanese Hezbollah acting very much in concert with the orders out of Tehran. And now they're achieving actually some operational successes there that we didn't see 6 months ago.
We spent 10 years, the United States, fighting in Iraq to create some sort of democratic, stable regime.
Right.
The Iranians are transporting a lot of equipment to Syria, flying over Iraqi airspace. Was that the way it was supposed to be when we devoted so much blood and treasure to trying to create a new Iraq?
Well, of course not, Wolf, but the world history has its own momentum. You've got a country, Iraq, that shares a border, that shares a religion, that shares economic conditions with Iran, and you put all that together, and there's going to be some kind of relationship between Iraq and Iran. Now, when we pulled out, we certainly didn't expect to see the airways used as a way for Iran to directly resupply Assad. But, and I would say that Iraq has not done enough to interrupt that resupply effort.
It's not just the flyovers. The Iraqis, the Shiite-led government of Nouri al-Maliki in Baghdad, is doing a lot more than just that to help Iran in Syria.
Well, I'm not sure how much more they're doing. I think there's a fear that if Assad goes, then Al-Anbar province with its Sunnis could become a problem if a Sunni-dominated Syrian government comes into play. So what we're watching is Maliki's centralization of power in the executive branch, which is allowing him to do some of this, something that with the Sunnis and the Kurds trying to work together to offset him in the government, and certainly the latest elections put Maliki on the back foot. His party lost last week some of their provincial strength. We're going to see some political give and take, I think, here.
We're seeing a lot of bloodshed in Iraq right now. We don't pay a whole lot of attention to it.
You're right.
Because U.S. troops are out. But they're killing each other like crazy with these terrorist bombings.
Today, again, more than a dozen killed, several dozens wounded. This is primarily al-Qaeda trying to reincite the sectarian warfare, the ethnic violence. They have not succeeded. So far, imperfectly, Iraq is trying to settle its issues through politics. It's imperfect, but it is interesting as we watch the Arab Spring break out and the massive demonstrations in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Yemen. But did you notice in Iraq there weren't massive demonstrations? Could it be that they believe that they actually have some say-so in their government? In other words, imperfectly, they are still trying to settle issues inside using politics. Now, the Iran and Syria issue is a serious one. We've demarched them about this, and we still think they're not doing enough to stop supporting that Iranian resupply.
Because you served in Iraq. You fought there. You know the sacrifices that Americans made starting in 2003, and you know how much money we spent, and hundreds of billions of dollars to create an Iraq. And the question is this, and then I want to get back to Syria. The question is this: knowing what you know now, the relationship between the government in Iraq and the Iranians, was it worth it?
Well, history is going to have to tell on that.
But you served there, General.
Right, I have.
So you have some thoughts about whether or not the men and women who fought there and the American taxpayers who paid for it, was that war, knowing what we know now, worth it?
If Iraq, sitting at the geostrategic center of the Middle East, continues to mature in a democratic way, then I would say yes. Now, there's a big if, and
That's
I realize
a huge
that.
if, yeah.
However, I think if you ask the troops coming home from World War II, we went to free Europe, you know, the ones who fought in Europe. Did you really intend in 1948 to see half of Europe enslaved by the Soviet Union? They said, that's not what I fought for. History, when you deal with warfare, you're dealing with a fundamentally unpredictable phenomenon. It's all the more important to get your goals straight at the outset so you know what you want to do. And we, I think, gave the Iraqi people a chance, and they appear to be imperfectly, so far, still working that chance forward for democracy.
We wanted to keep a few U.S. troops there, but the Iraqis would not give immunity to U.S. military personnel who remained behind. As a result, everybody left. Who's to blame for that?
Well, these negotiations are very difficult.
Because you were in the midst of those negotiations.
I was, yes. They are difficult negotiations. I believe that what we were doing there was trying to come to an agreement, but the way in which we had conducted our efforts in Iraq had made it very difficult for Maliki to acquiesce to the sovereignty issue over the troops. I don't think that it was any one person to blame. These are what happens in the give and take of international diplomacy. It's just it didn't work out. Now, could it have worked out? It would have taken both sides. It takes two to tango. And yes, it could have worked out. But the fact is, right now, we have not seen all the disasters that have been portrayed in the press of what was going to happen when we pulled out. It still hasn't happened.
And we're going to talk about Afghanistan, because we're in the midst of similar negotiations with the government in Kabul right now. But let's get back to Syria for a moment. You're now retired. You're free to speak out and say whatever you want. And I know you will. You're fully capable of giving us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So what, if anything, should the United States be doing to get rid of Bashar al-Assad, assuming that's what the U.S. wants?
Yeah, well, frankly, Ms. Harmon, too, I've always kind of spoken my own mind. In fact, I've done it enough that it's a privilege to be invited here, because it's a privilege to be invited in front of any polite company anymore after some of the things I've said. Unfortunately, my mother 91 years old, knows how to use a computer, and for you young men, make certain what you say, your mother is not going to chew you out for it, because even as a 4-star general, it doesn't rate well with your mom. On Syria, I would just tell you on Syria, Wolf, ladies and gentlemen, that we are going to have to determine what is the end state we want. This war needs to be ended as rapidly as possible. That's the bottom line. But if the Americans go in, if the Americans take leadership, if the Americans take ownership of this, it's going to be a full-throated, very, very serious war. And anyone who says this is going to be easy, that we can do a no-fly zone and it'll be cheap, I would discount that at the outset.
That's what Senator McCain says.
Well, and I'm not pointing at any one person. I'm not...
He says that the U.S. should engage, even without a UN Security Council resolution, a no-fly zone over Syria.
We need some sort of international imprint, whether it's Arab League or GCC. We need the region to provide some sort of framework within which we would operate. Then we need to be very clear about our military end state contributing to what political end state. Otherwise, you're liable to invade a country, pull down a statue, and then say, now what do we do? You know what I mean?
We've been there. We've done it.
Yeah.
If the U.S. were to begin what Senator McCain and others want, a no-fly zone, meaning the Syrian Air Force couldn't fly helicopters, couldn't fly jets, couldn't fly anything over Syrian airspace, as the U.S. and others did in Libya, for example, it would be a lot more difficult. In Syria, they have a much better air defense system than the Libyans had. Now, we're not even, these
Right.
aren't apples. This is a huge,
Yeah.
so presumably the U.S. would first have to knock out all of the Syrian air defense systems. Is that right?
That's correct, but let's fall back to the political end state. Why do you want to take out their air support? Is it because they're using aircraft to kill most of the people on the ground? No, they're not. They're using artillery, machine guns, and mortars and snipers. So let's have a reason for what we're going to do. And believe me, ladies and gentlemen, I've been up on the border in Jordan where the magnificent Jordan Armed Forces are compassionately doing what they can for these refugees. I've seen refugees in Africa and Asia. I've seen them in the Dalmatian coast. I have never seen refugees as traumatized as I've seen there. We all want to do something to stop this. But the desire to do something, the intention to do good, does not take the place of pragmatic, what is possible. We have no moral obligation to do the impossible and hawk our children's future because we think we just have to do something. In order to do a no-fly zone, you'd have to say that's going to have an effect that you, the American people, want. So who is making the argument to you that this is what we need you to sign up for? Next, we have to show it's going to be militarily possible. I guarantee you, if ordered to do it, CENTCOM can do a no-fly zone. Guarantee you. It'll be very expensive. It'll have tankers. It'll have fighter planes up constantly. It will drain the Treasury. It will take our hard-pressed military into one more fray. It's going to require helicopters and special forces to recover the pilots who get shot down. And can we do it? We're not a life insurance corporation. If the Commander-in-Chief says go, we go. Can we do it? Absolutely. And the killing will go on the ground because they're not using aircraft to do most of the killing already.
Yeah, I don't think this administration, this president, is going to order anything along those lines.
Yeah.
After Iraq and Afghanistan, I think the American public is pretty weary of wars right now as well. But what about arming the so-called good guys in this battle? There are a lot of opposition to Bashar al-Assad, but some of those guys are not necessarily friendly to the United States. No. They're al-Qaeda supporters and worse. So how do you know if the U.S. is going to supply weapons to the Iraqi opposition? How do you guarantee that these weapons won't wind up in the hands of al-Qaeda?
Well, guaranteeing it, Wolf, will be very difficult.
So there's no guarantee.
But first of all, you can get to a reasonable level of assurance, I think, by using the secret services from the surrounding countries that are friendly to us to vet the people coming in. Then you do training, and I don't mean 5 days of kind of wave a magic wand. I'm talking weeks of training, individual and small unit, that's both technical and tactical, but more importantly, it's ethical. And then to some degree, I think whether it be civilian, CIA paramilitary officers, or U.S. Special Forces, someone to accompany them at some level and just keep an eye on what they're using the weapons and training for. And I think there's a way to do it, but again, it's a commitment. It's not a donation. This is significant for a country that is once more going to find itself at odds with, in the midst of a very, very confusing situation on the ground in the Middle East.
Given the risks, is it smart for the U.S. to provide weapons to the Iraqi opposition?
Syrian opposition.
I mean, excuse me, to the Syrian opposition.
Right. I think that that would be something I'd have to defer to the people who are more current than I am. It's a very dynamic situation, but I think that if it's done properly and it's done with a sense, ladies and gentlemen, of full effort, not of modest effort, not of we're going to just go so far, not of troop caps. If we're going to do it, let's not go halfway, because once we start this, then the Americans' standard is on the line. And we don't need to demonstrate impotence or we could just increase the savagery if we don't do it right, more weapons, increase the savagery, but not do well enough to end the war. We need to end this fight as soon as possible. So that's the direction I would take.
Well, and I think you underscore a point that is worth making. And I've been covering the military for a long time, going back to the first Gulf War when I was CNN's Pentagon correspondent. Isn't it true? Well, I'll ask you the question. Is it true that when it comes to military engagement, potentially like in Syria, the U.S. military is much more reluctant to do it than some of the political and civilian leadership?
Well, I mean, It depends. What a crummy answer. But, ladies and gentlemen, if we get a clearly defined political end state, and then we do our study and we determine what military actions will contribute, and then we lay out, here's what we need to do it, then we would be willing to go in to do it.
Well,
but
the military
not,
will always salute and obey.
We
but
will.
the question is, in the debates that go on, in the discussions, you guys and the fighting men and women of the U.S. military, you have to worry about sending young people into harm's way, and you're always worried about what could happen, worst-case scenarios, whereas some of the political types, they don't necessarily focus in on that.
Well, there's a fondness and appreciation and respect that you develop from, I grew up for 40 years in the Marine Infantry. Infantry is called infantry because infant soldier, young soldier, and I've signed over 1,600 next to kin letters. So yes, we're reluctant to do so, but we also know some things are worth fighting for. And if you and your elected leaders tell us to go, I assure you the U.S. military will stand obedient and they will give 100% again. The military is not worn out. It's not tired. It's not frayed. Our families are very brittle, and that should be understood. But the U.S. military is quite capable of giving our enemies their longest day and their worst day if ordered to do so. But we cannot fight wars. We should not fight wars without a clearly defined end state that has gone in front of all of you, and you nod and say, as bad as war is, that's what I want our sons and daughters to do. And secondly, these are the first wars we have fought in our nation's history with no reserve. In other words, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we have gone into these fights, and because of troop caps, we have committed everyone. Now, what does that mean to you? Why did George Washington have reserves? Why did General Grant have reserves? Why did Douglas MacArthur have reserves? Because if something goes wrong, you have a way to avert a problem. If you see an opportunity, you have a way to exploit. We have not fought these wars with any reserves as we do calculations one by one of how many troops to put into a fight. Let me give you an example. We talked a lot about a surge into Afghanistan. Anyone know how many policemen there are in New York City? Around 40,000, I think, approximately. The surge was 30,000 into a country the size of Texas. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is the greatest nation on earth, and when you go to war, it can't be a half step. It's a terrible step. Don't ever take it if you can avoid it. Negotiate, talk, diplomacy, whatever. But if you go, it should be compelling from day one.
But that 30,000 came in on top of the, 100,000 that were, if you add all the NATO troops, most of whom were U.S., that were already there.
In Afghanistan, we have the largest wartime coalition in modern history, 50 nations. But at the same time, you have to have a very certain trumpet. Think of the cavalry charging across the desert plains out here, out to the west a little bit, and think of the trumpet blowing retreat. You can't have that. You're just going to confuse people. So you've got to be very clear that we didn't want a war, and here's why we're going, and then you do whatever is necessary, whatever that is.
It's the Colin Powell doctrine, which you believe in, right?
Very much so.
You fought in the first Gulf War?
I did.
Or were you still in elementary school then?
No, well...
Yeah, he remembers. I know exactly how old you are, and I know how old I am, too.
Right.
And just to give you some perspective, I have a 91-year-old mother as well. So,
yeah.
But she's not watching she's on the streaming
Right.
on the computer. All right, let's wrap up Syria, because I want to move on. I got other subjects. A year from now, will Bashar al-Assad still be in power?
It depends. Right now, Bashar Assad has more reliable, committed allies than the opposition. And when you get into a brawl, the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them or fighting with allies who are not fully committed. Bashar Assad has got the full support out of Tehran and out of Lebanese Hezbollah. So
and he's got a lot of Iraqi Shiites supporting him, too, militias.
He does. They have also rallied to his cause. But at the same time, there's a lot of other people that come in on the side of the opposition should they choose to do so. But so far, it has not been as strong a support. So that's what will determine.
If Bashar al-Assad were to be removed and the opposition, the good guys in the opposition, as opposed to the al-Nusra, the bad guys, were to take over, what would that mean for Iran and for Hezbollah in Lebanon?
For Iran, when Assad falls, it'll be their biggest strategic setback in 25 years. It will set them back from their Mediterranean front. It will give the impression to the Lebanese people who, after the Cedar Revolution, watched it robbed from them by Tehran and Lebanese Hezbollah and Syria. It'll give the impression that their political folks can run for office without fear of being killed. Lebanese Hezbollah will be somewhat defanged. I say somewhat because they're still a pretty murderous outfit. But it'll be the biggest setback for Iran since the revolution.